woke up this morning. I was thinking about our meeting, and I didn't really have anything, and I was just thinking, oh, we'll just go with it. But I did. A friend of mine, actually, he's a um, elder in the church. He sent me a post this morning um, from a gentleman. Have you heard of the name Brian Simmons?
No.
I haven't either. So I don't know who that is, but anyways, this post says, I often get to speak to church leaders in a region. One of the things I teach is about the 10 tests that every servant of Jesus in every ministry is tested on. God is faithful to lead us into one triumph after another. And so there's 10 of these. I don't know if we get them all, but maybe I can throw some of these out there and
Okay.
maybe share a little bit of your experiences, and we could talk about it, a little bit. All right. So test number one, the first step is always the hardest. Launch out into the deep. Faith. So you understand the context of what he's talking about? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it's funny you started with that one. I actually did a blog post this week talking about not the exact story, but about Peter walking on the water. And the real question I posed was, what she asking is, what does God want to make possible? Right? And so in that context, when he asked them to launch out into the deep, he is trying to make something possible that they didn't think was.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always felt that one of the dangers I've always had, especially with a corporate training, military training, was it breeds a kind of pragmatism in you. Mm-hmm. You don't want you by default you don't take risks.
Mm-hmm.
You try to do what you can to ensure success.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, that's how we're judged. And sometimes success in our context is not failing.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you succeed, you just don't fail.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we couch things, we try to say, this didn't go wrong. We don't always focus on what went right.
Yeah.
And what we mute is all, when you think about the miracles, maybe that's why we don't preach and talk about the miracles anymore. Because the people on the receiving end often took huge risks for it to happen. And we don't do that.
Yeah.
They were willing to be mocked, made fools of, because they trusted something that God said.
So you think it's a fear of failure?
I can tell you, for me, often it is.
Yeah.
It's a fear of failure. It's and some of it is just about being bred to play it safe. I mean, when I was growing up, you went to college because college was the safest pathway into the middle class American dream.
Mm-hmm.
And you majored in things that got you jobs. It didn't matter if you liked it.
Yeah.
Where were the jobs at? You major in that.
Yeah.
You move to the city because that's where the job is.
Yeah.
Your life, when you think about it, has been, at least for me, has been bred into doing all you can to ensure success and mitigate failure.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that might seem off path, you were mocked for it.
Yeah.
Why would you major in philosophy, or
yeah,
how would you move there?
Right.
And all along the way, we're telling people that God wants to make great things possible, but we don't put ourselves in positions to where we have to find that out. That's why I've always been impressed with people who will plant a church and just be out there on the net,
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Or be missionaries.
So,
even if people's motives are bad,
yeah,
they still have more courage than most of us.
Yeah.
Because they're still willing to not play it safe. And I can respect that.
Well, see, what you're saying. I got a million things running through my mind, but one, I think I've come to realize more and more how much I do fear failure and where that can drive me. Sometimes I've talked about with my wife about having for every gift and quality that we're given by God, I call it an anti-gift. It can work in a kind of an opposing way.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I think I have is loyalty. But in that, I can also see a fear of failure. Does that make sense?
It does.
So sometimes I may stick through something, and sometimes it's out of faith, out of love, faithfulness and loyalty. But then other times I may stick with it because I'm afraid of taking a risk or trying something different, or letting it fizzle or burn out, whatever that venture may be. So I see the great qualities, but sometimes as I reflect on it, I do see some elements of that, but also something you were talking about people launching out and planning a church. My experience with the Haven is pretty interesting. In some ways, it was a great leap of faith. In other ways, I think it was a great leap of ignorance. So all I've ever known is small church, man. I mean, I've spent very small amount of time in bigger churches. I grew up going to several different small churches. My mother raised me in, and then one particular small church where I got my roots. The Sunday school, children's Sunday school is a lot like our Sunday school, just a few kids. And I remember sometimes, I had memories of being there on Sunday, and it was just me and the Sunday school, teacher. Until I had a friend who's in ministry as a pastor now. We've been lifelong friends until he got there with his family, and then I had somebody really I had then I had a friend there who when I finally probably started enjoying going to church. But anyways, that's been my experience. And then coming out of college and when I got married, we got our roots. I got into ministry in a small Baptist church. And then coming out of that, which that church had its own issues and it fizzled out. And coming out of that, I was a part of another small church where I was associate pastor there. And then after that church is where Haven birthed in 2012 out of my home. And so all that to say is I didn't really ever have the investment of a bigger church system.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I didn't have, I think launching out of LifeSpring was more like a sister church multiplication more than a mother church planning a small church. Yeah. So, anyways, yeah, it was definitely a leap of faith. In some ways it could have been, one of those, what are you doing type of things. But yeah, and in other ways I've learned a lot of valuable lessons, but a lot of hard lessons too, of just diving in ignorance and experiencing it for myself. I had a pastor friend the other day. He was giving me some encouragement, and he was saying, man, actually it was the church we came out of. He's like, man, statistically speaking, you guys shouldn't still exist. But just you've persevered, you've stayed faithful. I think that's where that loyalty thing, thinking about it, being faithful, and even hard-headed, though I've wanted to give up, a few times along the way, just persevering. And here we are, 2012 to 2019, going on 7 years. But yeah, I can definitely attest to number one.
Yeah, so I just, I don't know. I mean, I think even just launching out to the deep, I guess, with that being said, I also don't want Christians to think that life is just a series of these kinds of moments.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a singular experience in the life of the disciples. It wasn't like their norm. Most of life every day is just ordinary faithfulness.
Yeah.
And I think that the mistake that we make sometimes is, okay, the pendulum will swing to where everything has to be this moment where we're launching off into the deep. No, most days are just ordinary.
Yeah.
You wake up and you do your thing, and you go to bed, and you do it again. I think it's really just what's important about that was they only should have done it because Jesus asked them to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because sometimes it's the opposite that happens. I think sometimes people launch off into the deep because they're edgy and they like taking risks, or sometimes they want to force God to do things.
Yes.
But so the opposite of that to me is just as dangerous. You sure it was him?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a lack of faith to ask that question.
Yeah.
You sure it was him? Because there are lots of voices these days.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the danger with lists like this is not, I'm certainly not criticizing the list. I just know that sometimes with lists, people can grade themselves against the list.
Yeah.
And sometimes feel like, okay, especially if you're a check the box person. You know what? This week I'm launching off into the deep.
Mm-hmm.
What if you're not supposed to?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Right. What if it's not? That's just, this person is not issuing dictums.
Mm-hmm.
They're giving principles.
Yeah. You remember back in it happened several times, but I remember in the 80s it was popular to predict the second coming of Christ.
Uh-huh.
And I remember one. I was a child, so I don't remember the details, but I remember family and friends who, there were those who would quit their jobs because I don't understand why you would quit your job if Christ was coming again. Why don't you just let the dominoes fall where they will, when he returns? But there was people that had actually quit their jobs anticipating the second coming of Christ.
But doesn't Paul talk about that? I think in one of his letters he said that we should be, something to the effect that we should be found faithful when he comes. That there were people. One of the reasons he wrote the letter was that people were doing that.
Mm-hmm.
He could come at any moment, so we just gonna sit back and wait for him to show up.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to. Yeah, exactly. I think that people take sometimes. I think the point is that people take the wrong lessons
mm-hmm.
from things like this, and I think that's one of the hardest things I have as a pastor, because there's so much information now. Mm-hmm. So people will watch something like this, or they'll watch a podcast, or they'll go to a conference, or there'll be a clip of something on social media, and then they govern their whole life according to this new thing that they heard until they hear the next new thing.
Yeah.
And that's just got to be a tough way to live.
Yeah.
where you feel like I'm not doing, disciples launched off into the deep, so I need to, and then without asking all of the pertinent questions, what was God trying to teach them when he did that?
Right.
What were the conditions in which that happened? I don't know. I think that we have, I've always been a fan of Eugene Peterson for this reason. That he always encouraged everyone to stop and slow down and listen better. Sometimes I think we're so action oriented, and I think that's what makes a list like this something that people respond to, because it's something that you do, right? You launch off into the deep. I don't know about you, but sometimes I probably have, as far as success goes, I have more success with the congregation when I'm telling them to act as opposed to getting them to sit and listen. Because nothing in our society really encourages you to do that.
Yeah.
This culture of busyness, this culture of, you just watch people now. They can rarely sit unstimulated.
Yeah.
They sit, they grab their phones, and there's something, their minds are always moving. Because it isn't the popular thing to sit and listen to what anybody has to say.
Yeah. No, I've seen it. I've seen I've gotten social media alerts from somebody in the congregation before while I'm preaching. It comes through on my, because I preach digital with my digital notes or whatever. Yeah. It's popped up before. Now there has been times where to be fair, where they've been checking in to the church or something on social media, but definitely a lot of distraction and so forth. But this might be something if we keep going. I don't know if you want to continue in the list.
Yeah, what's the next?
We might spread this out over a couple of podcasts. If
I think so, we can do that.
Yeah, we got plenty of time. So the first one was, the first step is always the hardest, launch out into the deep, faith. And the second one was the test of small beginnings. Not everything is easy.
Yes, Lordy. Not much to say about that one.
Yeah.
The fact, though, that you have to call it out, I think also is an indictment about our expectations. When you look at the history of a lot of movements, they have always been, slow. They almost simmered, over time. And then I think, we see articles, was it like Christianity Today or something like that? You have this list they do once a year with the fastest growing congregations in America.
Yeah.
I think psychologically that list probably hurts more pastors than any list I see.
Yep.
Because the instant thing to think is, what are those guys doing?
Yeah.
That I'm not doing.
No.
I can see why number 2 had to be said, because we often judge ourselves by really outliers. I was looking at a list. I think it was either Barner or someone that talked about church size, and I'm always shocked by what they consider medium-sized churches, because most people, I think a lot of guys have the expectation that churches with 1,000 members are normal.
Yeah.
And statistically, there are anomalies.
Right.
But I think because we only see or hear from them, We think it's normal.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that their story is not unique. It's just that we're not doing something right, or we would get what they're getting.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I encouraged the African American Fellowship for the Texas Baptists. I said, one way you could probably encourage more pastors is having them hear from people in the largest demographic of the churches. Whereas if the majority of churches are under 75 members, if that's what they're saying is true, then the platform at some point should be manned by someone under 75.
Yeah.
As opposed to every speaker being essentially a megachurch pastor, because that doesn't represent the convention.
Mm-hmm.
The convention is made up of small church folks. So I think, to reset people, maybe you should hear from some of them, even if it's not the main stage, the breakout sessions, because we never hear from anyone like ourselves. Everyone we hear from is on TV.
Well, that's why it's such an encouragement. I've told you and Andy both, when we've had our breakfasts and lunches and stuff, that's such an encouragement just to sit with you guys and hear your stories and relate in the rewards and in the struggles. That there's something about realizing what's the norm that puts your the trials and tests that you're going through into context. When you normalize it, when you realize that others go through or going through the same thing, you know what I mean? That you're not alone. You're not on an island. In that same conversation I had with a friend the other day, and he was encouraging me, talking about the things that he saw. As he was saying, that you guys are still a church and doing good things after 7 years. I know that a lot of that couldn't have been accomplished on my end, at least, without a work of identity in me that God had to work in me. Because there is a lot of comparison that's, going on. There is a lot of looking at, some of these ideal churches and saying, what are we doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? And to an extent, I think, there's health. It is healthy to ask those questions. Hey, what can we do better? Or are there things that we're getting in our own way, that is stunning, whether it's spiritual or numerical growth. I think we constantly want to be asking those questions. But I think between faith walking ministry that I got involved in and ministry of Carl Vader's, which is a small church ministry that, I've spoken about that. I mean, that's been huge for me. That's something that God brought about at the perfect time in my life. And I think without God putting those things in place for me, I don't know. I don't think I would be, where I'm at now. I don't know if you've ever seen the shirt that I've worn. If you look at my profile pic on Facebook, wearing a shirt that says the world's okayest pastor. And I love the humor in it. I love goofy humor like that, but it's also, in a way, that's a work of identity. It's a work of preaching to myself. One of the drums that I beat, I'm kind of going the opposite direction of a lot of things that are preached in the pulpit. A lot of us were preaching about greatness, and I agree. Let's do great things for God, but one of my things is, wait, hold on a second. That depends on how you define greatness.
Mm-hmm.
What does greatness look like? I think that's the problem. And that goes back to the beginning with the disciples. They define greatness wrong, you know? So it's one thing to say, let's do something great for God, but is our definition of greatness, is it more defined by Christ, or is it more defined by our culture? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I've seen people use, hey, chase your dreams, and they've used Joseph, Joseph in Genesis, not Jesus as Joseph, as an example of chasing your dreams. But what we don't think about is that was God's dream that he had given to Joseph.
Right.
Yeah, it wasn't, and not that God doesn't work in our passions and stuff. I mean, one of the reasons I didn't have a vision, you know, when I got involved in ministry, it was a passion within me. But to ask, like you said, you mentioned this earlier, is it God's dream? You know, is God putting that there, or am I putting that there? And so sometimes we step out and we want God to follow along, you know what I mean? And we're wanting to do great things for God, but our definition of greatness has gotten distorted by what we think success in a church looks like. So one thing I've proposed to our congregation in the past is, are you willing, you know, a lot of you may be willing to do something great for God, and you're doing a lot of measuring and doing that. And I'm not saying don't do something great, you know, don't seek to do great things, but what does greatness look like? And are you willing, can your definition of greatness, are you willing to be just a cog in God's wheel?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You know, it's funny. I was reading, Garrett Kell has told this story before. It shows up on social media every now and then. But I was telling someone that I feel that ministry really feeds some people's narcissism. You know, the idea of being out in front and wanting to grow and growing your brand, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get people to know who you are? And he was saying how when he first got converted, he would tell his testimony and how impactful it would be to people, and he would receive invitations. And he got an invitation to a place where John Bryson was the youth and young adult pastor, something like that. And Bryson gave him a job. It was open the curtain for the speakers. And he talked about all the turmoil in his heart because he felt that he could have done a better job than the people on the stage, and why wasn't he being used? His article was entitled, "Don't Photobomb Jesus." And he just talked about those issues of our heart, about really, you know, whose glory are we seeking? Do we seek God's glory as long as we get some? Or is it a matter where we get the glory and we'll share some with God? And it's always just, at the end of the day, it's always a heart thing for us. And small beginnings test that. Yeah. Right? You know, sometimes that beginning lasts for a long time. Sometimes that's the end game. And no matter what people say or do, we know what's in our heart. And I can honestly say that often, it's not as often as they should be, motives aren't always pure. What are people saying about me? Or sometimes you see someone and you say, I'm as good as this guy is. Yeah, I should have what they have. I made a post on our church Facebook page about jealousy, you know, about the fact that coveting what someone else has causes you to not see what God is doing uniquely in your own life. And one of the things that's kept me somewhat sane is knowing that God doesn't have a scorecard based on me as compared to someone else. the only scorecard he has for me is based on what his expectations are for me.
Yeah.
If that means you faithfully passing 50 people till you die,
So good. Yeah.
then you will be counted as faithful. You
Amen.
may not be counted as successful,
Amen.
but you'll be counted as faithful. And I think as long as we conflate success and faithfulness, we're always going to be unhappy and dissatisfied with ministry because we can't enjoy it because we're always trying to grow it.
You got it. Identity, man. Once we know, once it starts to click who we are, who God's made us to be, and we're fine with that. Like you said, and one of the issues is in that identity, when I start to grab onto it, who God has made me to be, and then even to maybe even step forward and say something like you suggested of maybe this is the end game. What if this is the end game? What if God always intends me to some people, and this has been my struggle, because I think there's the rock star personality, that wants to be something big and is grabbing for the stars. And I think somebody like me, it's not it hasn't been a grabbing for the stars. It's been a care, worrying about what other people think, and when you hold on to this identity, well, maybe this is who I am. This person over here saying, well, oh, you're just settling.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that's been my struggle more than wanting to be the rock star.
Well, think about it, right? Even when guys sometimes encourage you or pray for you, they pray for you as if that's what you should want.
Yes.
Right? They pray to grow and increase. They never pray for you to be satisfied where God has you.
And I'll be honest with you, and I'm sorry for cutting you off.
You know what I'm saying? Or to be effective where you are. We just assume that's what everybody should have.
Yeah. And I've got to learn in the same vein to be more patient with some of those guys, and then know what's my proper boundaries in being in relationship, because I tend to gravitate you guys, guys like you and Old Town Spring Heights Community Association. You pastors really rejuvenate me, and I've got other friends out there outside of your group. Most of my friends are small church pastors, but I've met acquaintances in the past where, you spend 30 minutes with them, and I'm feeling, I'm feeling deflated and defeated, and that they may, in some ways, that may say more about where I'm at, in the moment. But I've definitely struggled being around those that I feel like they're still in that paradigm that I'm not in anymore, and I've fought so hard to get away from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's hard being judged all the time. It's hard, because tacitly they can, without saying it, and they might not even mean it that way, but it's almost they're assuming that you lack ambition.
Yes.
What's wrong with you? You should want it to be. Even when I see articles about it, there's always almost the apology in the beginning. Churches, there's nothing wrong with growth. Churches should want to grow. God will grow. And it's not that people are anti-growth, but when I think about it, right? Let's say we believe that God loves all his people, right? And there's a Christian community in some rural town that's never going to be able to support a large capital campaign, never going to be able to have lots of members and support the infrastructure that we see in a city. Why would a person take an assignment there if they still have the values of a culture that says everything that's bigger is better? And you have to have some people who will be content serving those people no matter how God provides in a context like that. Because it's not to say that God can't. Even when I see stories where this person went to a rural community, and next thing you know, there are 2,000 people. I say that's great, but there are going to be some times when it's not that way. It's always going to be 60 people,
Yeah.
right? And I said, I think that's why I'm saying that it would be great to see those stories, which are more typical, get reported on with the same amount of fervor, with the same amount of fervor as the outlier.
Yeah.
Because people need to see stories that reflect their reality to know I'm not crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are other people out here just like me who just are going to serve these 60 people because that's what God wants me to do,
Mm.
you know, and that's okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I will, you know, I'll just end with, you know, not definitely don't despise the small beginnings, but sometimes the small beginnings is what it is.
Yeah. End game.
It's the end game sometimes, and it's not a reflection on you or the people. You talked about being in Zambia. Don't sound like there'll be any mega churches there anytime soon.
Yeah.
Right? But 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 shouldn't God want the gospel to flourish there?
Yeah. And because there's no mega churches, that doesn't mean it's not flourishing.
Right.
It could
Exactly.
be quite the opposite. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's good stuff.